Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Jill O'Donnell, the director of the Clayton Yeutter Institute of International Trade and Finance here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And it's just my pleasure to welcome you all here for this discussion on U.S.-Japan trade relations today. I'd like to thank the Asia Society Policy Institute and Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their support and partnership of this event. And I'd especially welcome our guest from the Embassy of Japan, who's here today as well. This year, we've seen a lot of changes in trade policy, and today we're going to examine what's happening and what may be next with the U.S.-Japan relationship in terms of trade and foreign investment and economics. And to kick us off today, I'd like to invite Mike Boyle, president of Kawasaki Motors Manufacturing Corporation, to help paint the picture of what this foreign investment really looks like on the ground and the impact that it has. Mike is a Husker alumnus. He graduated from the University of Nebraska with a degree in mechanical engineering and then joined Kawasaki Motors in Lincoln as an engineer. And after much hard work and many promotions, Mike was selected as president and CEO of Kawasaki Motors Manufacturing Corporation in 2022, becoming the first non-Japanese president in the history of Kawasaki's global operations. He's active on several boards and industry groups and was inducted into the Nebraska Business Hall of Fame earlier this year. So it's my pleasure to welcome Mike Boyle to kick us off today. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Jill, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me. I'm going to start off assuming that a lot of you don't really know about Kawasaki, who we are, what we do. So I'm going to do that and then segue into how Kawasaki affects the global economy and the U.S. economy, and particularly the Nebraska economy, and follow up with some statistics about Japan investment in the United States to kind of paint a background for the conversation a little bit later. So Kawasaki, of course, founded in Japan over 100 years ago, and we're made up of 5 distinct companies and over 100 subsidiary companies. The data I'm going to show you is from 2024. Our fiscal year runs from April 1 to March 31. Last year, our total sales globally was $14.9 billion. We employed almost 41,000 employees. Kawasaki started off as a shipbuilding company. We make large ocean-going vessels to transport materials and supplies and product across the ocean. We build submarines and submersibles. We have an aerospace company. Kawasaki designs and manufactures their own aircraft and helicopters. We also work with Boeing and Embraer and Airbus to build components for their aircraft globally. Kawasaki made part of the International Space Station. They make jet engines and rocket fairings. We have a company that builds power plants, manufacturing plants, sports stadiums, bucket excavators, boring bars that bore tunnels under mountains and under seabeds. So the picture on the lower left-hand side part of the slide is the boring bar that dug the tunnel between France and England to connect them with their high-speed rail. Kawasaki was the first non-U.S. company to design and build robots outside of the United States. So we've been doing that for quite some time. We see ourselves as a technology and automation company, first and foremost. We make precision hydraulic equipment for Caterpillar, John Deere, and companies like that. We have a rolling stock company which makes the high-speed Shinkansen trains that you hear about in Japan, Taiwan. Japanese engineering is behind the Chinese rail system. And you can see some of the different products we make, diesel locomotives. The picture on the far lower right is the New York City subway car that we're building right now in Lincoln. Most people think of Kawasaki, they think of this company, power sports and engines, motorcycles, and jet skis. This is the only customer-focused part of our business. Every other part of our business is either selling to other businesses or to government agencies. And we have over 116 subsidiaries and affiliates making all manner of different kinds of products. So we're really quite diverse and across the spectrum around the globe, making lots of different kinds of products. Some really cool ones are surgical robots and nurse-assisted robots. So here's Kawasaki in the United States. The blue dots are manufacturing plants, and the orange dots are sales and service sites. There are 18 in the U.S. Kawasaki employs about 5,500 people, and sales from these 18 sites equal about $4.7 billion. Who I work for is Kawasaki Motors Manufacturing Corp, or KMM. We have 3 factories, one here, of course, here in Lincoln, 2 in Missouri, and Maryville and Boonville. To date, we've invested about $2.7 billion in these 3 factories. This is the Maryville campus, the northwest corner of Missouri. Northwest Missouri State University is located there. We employ about 1,100 people there. The factory is about a million square feet. Production started there in June of 1989. This is our Boonville, Missouri campus. It's right by Columbia, Missouri, University of Missouri. We tend to locate our factories near schools. It's great for recruiting, so remember that. We employ about 300 people there. The factory is about 250,000 square feet, and we started production in February 2022. These are the products those 2 factories make. They are engines for the lawn and garden industry, for utility vehicle and golf cart industry. You see some of our main customers, John Deere, Toro, Ariens, and so on. I can't tell you the exact number of engines that we're going to make this year, but it's in the high hundreds of thousands. So we make a lot of engines for, these are strictly for the U.S. market with some exports. This is the Lincoln campus. We're just north of the Lincoln Airport. We employ a little over 3,000 people right now. The plant is a little over 2.3 million square feet. It's the largest manufacturing plant in Nebraska. Production started in December 1974. Matter of fact, a year ago, we celebrated our 50th anniversary. We have 3 divisions in the Lincoln plant. The first is consumer products, where we make personal transportation vehicles, utility vehicles, recreation utility vehicles, and also all-terrain vehicles. This year, we'll make a little over 46,000 of those vehicles. We have a railcar division, and our railcar division makes subway and commuter rail cars for metropolitan transit authorities on the East Coast. That's where the bulk of that transportation is. We made the rail cars for the Washington Metro a few years back. As I mentioned before, the car on the lower left is the latest car we're making, subway car for New York City. We're making a little over 1,600 of those rail cars. This year, we'll ship 340 cars to New York. And we have an aerospace division. And right now, we are making cargo doors for the Boeing 777, 777X aircraft. You can see the exploded picture on the lower left. The green parts of the aircraft are made by Kawasaki. And then the Lincoln plant's making the 2 doors that you see. We'll make 80 doors this year. So talk about supply chain a little bit. Manufacturing plants, we cannot make everything by ourselves internally. We have to import. We need help. We need a lot of companies to make product for us to go into our vehicles. Take, for instance, a rail car. There are 40,000 different part numbers in a rail car. We can't make all those. So we import a lot of materials, and we also buy domestically. So right now, last year, we imported over $517 million worth of components into our factory. This year, the tariffs are going to cost us an additional $170 million just in duties. So it's really been disruptive to our business. And these are our U.S. suppliers and business partners for our 3 factories. And this is just a basic representation. We have over 1,200 that we built up over the 50 years that we've been here. Those 1,200 suppliers represent about 22,000 people that are dedicated to Kawasaki, is an estimate, Kawasaki production. And we purchased almost $900 million worth of U.S. parts and services last year. What we make from our plants represents about 2.1 billion in retail sales. And on the left-hand side, the Lincoln plant is about 61% of what we manufacture, what we sell. And you can see the dealerships in the map of the United States. We have 1,100 dealers that are selling the products that we make in Lincoln, which represents about almost 24,500 personnel selling Kawasaki products. On the right-hand part of the screen are the Boonville plant's sells, the dealerships that sell those products. There's about 7,700 dealers, which represents about 54,000 people representing those products. So you can kind of see the last two slides, the dynamics of how one company, and we're just a medium-sized manufacturing company, how that affects, how it ripples out throughout the economy. And we also export. So we export about 20% of our products overseas. It's about $265 million to the countries that you see represented there. Interestingly, we receive product from Japan to build our products, and we ship the completed vehicles back to Japan. So kind of an interesting play on movement of materials. And here's Japan's investment in the United States. I know this is kind of interesting. We're just kind of showing you our investment, but here's the overall investment. Japan is the #1 foreign investor in the U.S. at $819 billion. The #1 in manufacturing employment in the United States at almost 530,000 people. Japan has spent the second largest amount of R&D in the U.S. at $11.5 billion. They have the total U.S. employment of any foreign country at almost 1 million people working for Japanese companies. They're the #1 foreign investor in 40 of the 50 U.S. states, and the top 3 investor in all 50 states. So I think this kind of gives you a little bit of a background and taste of the interplay and dynamics of trade between Japan and the U.S. Japan's a very important partner overall to the United States, and more than just trade and many other things. And so I hope this gives you a little feeling for how that dynamic works. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that, Mike. That was a really excellent example of what foreign investment can mean, especially over this long period of years that Kawasaki has built up here in the United States. So we're going to segue now into a broader discussion of everything that you have just laid out for us. And it's my pleasure to introduce Wendy Cutler for this discussion. Wendy is a senior vice president of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Based in Washington, D.C. In this role, she focuses on leading initiatives that address challenges related to trade, investment, economic security, and innovation, as well as women's empowerment in Asia. Prior to joining the Asia Society Policy Institute, Wendy had a career of nearly 3 decades as a diplomat and negotiator in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she also served as acting deputy U.S. Trade Representative. During her career at USTR, she worked on a range of bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade negotiations and initiatives, including the U.S.-Korea Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the U.S.-China negotiations, and the WTO financial services negotiations. She's published a series of papers from the Asia Society Policy Institute platform on the Asian trade landscape and serves as a regular media commentator on trade and investment developments in Asia and around the world. Wendy, it's my pleasure to invite you up here now. So Wendy, I know that Clayton Yeutter, our institute namesake, was the first U.S. trade representative that you worked for when you started at USTR. And so we're really happy to have you here on your first visit to Nebraska and the Yeutter Institute and the University of Nebraska. So Welcome, and thank you for coming to share your insight with us today.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I always wanted to come here in person. I know I've done some webinars in the past. But yeah, so, through my career, I worked for 9 U.S. trade representatives, both from the Democratic and Republican Party. Clayton Yeutter was the first U.S. chair I worked for. I was quite young in those days and wasn't, it was very new. And yet he treated me with so much respect. And through the years when I would see him, even after I left, he couldn't be warmer and just so on top of all of these issues. And just, again, like coming here, to an institute named after him just means a lot to me. So thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Wendy. And actually, Japan was very much on the table when Ambassador Yeutter served as the U.S. Trade Representative, so it's very fitting to have this discussion. So we were talking about this earlier and kind of setting the context. 50 years ago, Japan was really a trade adversary almost for the United States. That has really changed over the years. Today, as we know, they're the largest foreign direct investor in the United States and a major trading partner, an important market. So tell us what changed and how in that span of time.
How much time do we have? I mean, I'll be quick here, but when you think of the transformation of the U.S.-Japan economic relationship from the 70s, 80s, even up into the 90s versus now, it's like night and day. I mean, today, Japan is, if not our closest trading partner, is definitely in the top 3. But, during the 80s and 90s, when Ambassador Yeutter was working on these issues, there were so many problems with Japan, and it's hard to recall how threatened we felt by Japan in those days. I mean, Japan was, a manufacturing powerhouse, and it not only was, it started selling us textiles and cars that no one wanted to build, but over time, we felt threatened with respect to semiconductors, computers, supercomputers, you name the product. We were very nervous about Japan and very concerned that Japan's market was closed. And in particular, for this audience, it was very closed to agriculture, but at the same time, it was exporting lots of manufactured goods to the United States. And so we had a series of negotiations, both to limit the imports, but also to provide more market access so we could sell more of our goods to Japan. And Ambassador Yeutter was notorious for his negotiations with Japan, and particularly starting to open up Japan's agricultural market. We still have work left, but we're heading in the right direction.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the work that is left to do, as you say. So just to remind our audience of where we are now, because a lot has happened this year in trade policy and with tariff actions.
You think so?
I think so, Wendy, and you're commenting on it multiple times a day. So back in April, the president announced reciprocal tariffs on pretty much every trading partner, including Japan, and then countries have negotiated since then with the United States to try to lower that rate. With Japan in particular, the rate is now lowered to 15%. There are investment provisions where Japan is to invest $550 billion in the United States, and also some improved market access for agricultural goods and some other items too. This was announced in July. It was clarified a little bit more in September with some new documents that were issued. So what more can you tell us about what is in this deal? What's most important to understand about it?
Mm-hmm. So you're right. So we concluded a deal with Japan in July, and this was after many rounds of negotiations. And you could see the Japanese minister just getting on the plane every week trying to finally reach a conclusion to the deal, which ultimately was achieved. But these were tough negotiations and kind of very different than trade negotiations that I was involved in during my career. And I think one of the key differences is that for the most part, in these negotiations, we are looking to the trading partner to make 99% of the concessions, while the United States is giving very little in return. And when I used to negotiate, let's just say both sides gave. I mean, typically the other side gave a lot more, but it was a kind of more balance with respect to concessions. This isn't unique for Japan. This is happening across the board with many countries. And I always get the question, why don't they stand up? Why don't they ask for more from the United States? And I think here there's a number of reasons, but I think probably one of the key reasons is the unpredictability of our president and a fear that if they don't cooperate, they're going to be stuck with even more tariffs, which is of great concern, particularly when some of their competitors are getting lower tariffs through these trade agreements. So I think many countries, including Japan, almost felt like it had no other option but to go ahead and try and negotiate the best deal possible with the United States. The other key difference is that when we used to negotiate trade agreements, one of the reasons why they took so long is that they were very detailed. And we put it all in writing. And I'm not going to say that that solved any possible misunderstanding or misinterpretation, but it did go a long way in clarifying the commitments for both sides. So both sides knew what they had signed up for. This time around, there are very few documents, and frankly, many of the documents are just the US interpretation of the deal. So for example, even with Japan, right after the deal was announced, we already started hearing kind of different versions of what was agreed upon. And again, I think that, the key difference is, and I think it's extremely important to write it all down and to make sure that there is as much clarity and, and the least ambiguity possible, so implementation of the commitments can proceed smoothly.
Okay. So digging into that just a little bit more, I want to talk about the agriculture provisions, especially here first. So there's a market access aspect to this deal, which sounds like a purchase commitment. It says that Japan will have incremental purchases of U.S. agricultural products like bioethanol, soybeans, corn, fertilizers, and some other products too, totaling $8 billion per year. So first question for you is, how significant is this? And second question is there a time frame on this? If it's $8 billion per year, is there a number of years associated with this agreement that it's expected to be in force?
Okay, so first of all, per year, that's a great question. We don't know. Again, I'm assuming it means per year through the Trump term, but maybe it doesn't. So again, I think that needs to be clarified. But I think it is significant. $8 billion of additional agriculture purchases by Japan, particularly at a time when China is reducing its agriculture purchases from the United States, is a significant concession. However, the problem with purchase commitments is they're kind of one-time shots. So you're not changing the country's practices. You're not asking them to get rid of the barriers. You're basically saying, just go ahead and buy this stuff, and we're not going to look into kind of what the structure of your market is. So once this commitment, once whatever the number of years expire, technically Japan can just go back to where it was, right? And not be committed to procure this additional amount of goods. Hopefully it will lead to Japan continuing robust purchases, but there are no guarantees.
So to clarify, there's nothing, at least that we know of, in these agreements that suggests that Japan has lowered any tariffs they may have on these items or addressed any non-tariff barriers to further imports of any of these products.
The only concession in agriculture that has been spelled out beyond this purchase commitment is what Japan agreed to do vis-a-vis rice. But even here, once you really look at what Japan committed to, Japan has a quota on rice. That just means it has a limit of how much it's going to buy from all foreign countries. And that amount is reflected in its WTO commitments. So what Japan apparently agreed to in this deal is, in terms of its overall quota, that's going to stay the same, but the U.S. is going to get more. So you know what that means? Some other unlucky trading partner is going to be selling less rice to Japan. And when that partner figures out it's them, they may, be a little unhappy and angry at Washington.
So sticking still again with agriculture, so you have a lot of experience with trade negotiations in Asia, with Japan, other countries. What are the main sticking points, the long-standing kind of enduring sticking points on market access for agriculture in Japan?
So I think kind of the underlying problem, and this is one that like any negotiation with Japan on agriculture always comes up, is that it's they have a lot of protection in the sector because they have a politically powerful agriculture constituency that doesn't want to open the market, that it feels if the market is really truly opened, then they will lose, that they're not globally competitive. And so as long as that agriculture interests are politically powerful, then I think this is always going to be kind of an uphill battle with Japan to open the market further. Now, I've always heard this thing, well, the average age of the Japanese farmer, they keep getting older and older, so this is going to end with time. But you know what? It never really ends. I mean, I just remember in the early 2000s being with Ambassador Zellick at some meeting with the Japanese, and he was, telling them that, look, your average age of your farmers already, whatever, 70, and it's going to be higher, and so you might as well open up now and not wait, and blah, 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 blah. And, they were just kind of rolling their eyes and, yeah, we'll buy, we'll lower our tariff by 2 percentage points or something. So it's a very difficult slog. And Japan's not unique here because a lot of other countries and a lot of our trading partners have their own sensitivities. A lot of them are in the agriculture sector, but when negotiating with other countries, they always seem to have that set of products where it's just so difficult for them to open further.
And on the tariff front then, so the 15% rate that was negotiated for Japan as part of this deal is on top of any existing tariffs that may be in place already.
Right, the MFN tariffs, yes.
Right, on top of the most favored nation tariffs that are negotiated through the World Trade Organization. So it's still
or like anti-dumping tariffs or whatever. But for the most part, it's 15%. Our tariffs are very low. Before, President Trump took office, I think our average tariff was about 3%. So very low.
So I think back to the slide we saw just a few moments ago that Mike had up, showing the importance of imports to the supply chain of Kawasaki coming from several different places, but including Japan. So this then would ostensibly raise the cost for any imports from Japan that companies might rely on as part of their supply chain.
Well, absolutely. And Kawasaki's not unique here. We're hearing from a lot of U.S. companies that they feel that they're almost being penalized because they have to pay the U.S. tariffs on inputs for their goods. So the automobile industry, for example, is paying a 50% tariff on imports of steel and aluminum, and that really adds to their bottom line. And what they are arguing is that since Japan and Europe, for example, secured a 15% tariff on autos from the United States, that Japan's in a better position than U.S. auto companies because the Japanese suppliers that are in Japan don't have to pay that tariff.
Okay. So another way in which this deal is a departure from the traditional sort of usual way of doing things that you did, in your career, is that there's not really a traditional enforcement mechanism, for example. In fact, it seems like the U.S. holds the leverage, if you read the deal, that it will monitor the implementation and could potentially take some measures if it doesn't think the implementation is going well. Can you talk a little bit more about that aspect?
Sure. So in most trade agreements before the traditional trade agreements, you had a dispute settlement provision, which basically allows for each country, if we thought, let's just say Japan was violating its agreement, a panel would be set up, they would look at the facts, they'd hear the US case, they'd hear the Japan case, and then they would rule. But now in these agreements, including the latest agreement with Japan, there's no dispute settlement mechanism. And it basically means that the United States is kind of the judge, the jury, and the enforcer. So if the United States believes that Japan is not implementing its commitments, we can just decide that it's not, and the next day go ahead, let's just say, and increase tariffs back to the 25% for Japan. Now, I assume we would still want to consult with the country and see if we could reach an agreement, but not at all clear. And I think that contributes to what I would call kind of the fragility of many of these agreements. Because even if for the time being they look like they are settling the terms of trade between the United States and the country, there's so many things that can happen and occasions for other tariffs to be imposed against that country. And, it could lead countries to question what's the value of these agreements if I was just in these intense negotiations with Washington. I agreed to open up my market. I agreed to get rid of my tariffs. I agreed to invest billions of dollars in the U.S. market. I've agreed to purchase billions of dollars of U.S. goods. And now I'm being hit with additional tariffs. And so I think, for a combination of these kind of developments, you could see a point where certain countries really feel that these agreements are not, no longer in their interest.
So what about the durability of this agreement and others like it? So typically there would be a role for Congress in a free trade agreement. There doesn't appear to be one here. Can you comment on that piece?
Yeah, so another big change we've seen from trade, the way trade policy and trade negotiations are conducted under this administration versus previous administrations, including Trump's first term, is that Congress seems to be nowhere. And what's so surprising about that is that the Constitution gives Congress the ability, it gives them the right to impose tariffs and to really conduct trade policy. And Congress has been pretty quiet here and has kind of given a blank check to the executive branch. Now, what's interesting, and I'm sure it's another one of your questions, is the legislative branch is again, pretty quiet now. The judicial branch is a bit active now because a number of companies and other complainants have challenged the president's use of IEEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, as the legal basis for imposing these tariffs. The court case was recently heard by the Supreme Court, and a ruling is expected, some say later this year, I would bet on early next year. And if the ruling is against the president's use of this statute, the executive branch is going to need to use other statutory tools to keep tariffs on. And it could be a bit messy and a lot more uncertainty.
Would you say some of those tools are, for example, Section 232, the national security law? And my understanding is several of those investigations into several sectors are already well underway, and some even concluded.
Correct. So Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Act allows the president to impose tariffs on those products where they're national security threats. And here we've already implemented tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and autos, and probably a couple more sectors that I can't remember right now. But there are a number of other investigations underway. But there's other statutes as well that could be used. The challenge with these other statutes is none of them provide the kind of open authority that IEEPA does, meaning that some of them require public hearings or submission of comments, different reporting mechanisms. Some, like Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, has a ceiling of 15% for as high for the tariff, and tariffs under that statute can only be put in place for 150 days. So none of these other statutes are like perfect, but I'm fully confident that the administration has a plan B that it is ready to implement if indeed the Supreme Court turns down the IEEPA as an appropriate statute for imposing reciprocal tariffs.
Mm-hmm. And if IEEPA were to be found that this was not an appropriate use of IEEPA to impose these tariffs, what would that mean for these deals that have been negotiated on the basis of those?
Unclear. I mean, I assume the United States would continue to say, well, you all made commitments to the trading partner, you need to implement them. But the administration's ability to commit to the reciprocal tariff levels that they have will need to be reviewed and adjusted.
Okay. And what about the investment provisions then of this deal? That $550 billion is the big number that we've seen associated with this deal that Japan would invest in the United States. Again, we saw on Mike's slide, they already invest over $800 billion in the U.S. as our number one foreign investor. So what more do we know about what that might look like?
Right, so this is another kind of novel provision for one of these agreements, and that is Japan basically committed to an investment fund to be set up between the United States and Japan, under which Japan is now obligated to provide $550 billion of additional investment towards projects, whether it be infrastructure, energy, semiconductors, pretty open, but projects that initially would be recommended jointly by Japan and the United States. However, when you read the memorandum of understanding that the two sides concluded, it appears that the United States has the ability to tell Japan, even if Japan doesn't agree, we want your money for this project. And if Japan doesn't agree within 45 days, then Washington has the ability to either terminate the agreement or to raise tariffs again or take some kind of action. This is really kind of unprecedented, and frankly, I was quite surprised that Tokyo could agree to these provisions. Interestingly enough, after concluding this MOU, the administration then asked Korea for something similar, $350 billion. And the Koreans basically said, like, we can, the Korean president was quoted as saying, if I agree to this, I will be impeached. And as a result, negotiations continued, and some kind of accommodation was reached just a week ago and was released. And basically for Korea, they have a longer time period to provide the funds. So for Japan, my understanding is that $550 billion needs to be committed to projects from now through the remainder of Trump's term.
Yes, I've seen that too. What else would you be looking for in terms of clarity about this deal? We've talked about the tariffs, the investment provisions, and the market access. What else are you still wondering about?
Yeah, so there are also purchases in the agreement. And the other thing that Japan and other countries have been trying very hard to secure in these agreements are commitments that would kind of shield them from high tariffs that may be imposed or are being imposed under Section 232. So for Japan, its top priority in this negotiation was to get its auto tariff down to 15%. It was at 25%. And so as a result of getting that tariff down to 15%, Tokyo was much more amenable to agreeing to this investment fund. But they've also seemed to they'll be getting special treatment with respect to any further tariffs that come on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, two sectors that are also subject to 232 investigations.
Okay. What about also the competitive landscape in the region, Wendy? I wonder, reminding again our audience of the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal that you were instrumental in negotiating, and then the United States pulled out early in 2017, but it went forward with the other nations without the U.S. and has been in place now for a few years. How much is that putting the U.S. at a disadvantage vis-a-vis Japan, which is in the CPTPP agreement, or others? There's a new agreement, I understand, between Japan and the European Union. So what does that landscape look like for the U.S.?
So I think you're hitting on a really important point, Jill, and that is, while countries are concluding these trade agreements with the United States, that isn't the end of their work. In fact, many of them have gotten a wake-up call, and this is kind of regrettable, and the call basically is telling them, don't be over-dependent on the United States, either as a market or a source of inputs, because we are becoming an unreliable partner, and that they need to diversify their trading partners, they need to diversify the markets where they're selling goods, but also diversify the sources of supply. And that means reducing both exports and imports from the United States. And so we are seeing a lot of trade activity among other countries, not only in the Asia-Pacific region, but frankly all over the world, as they are trying to cement their own trade agreements. And this could end up really biting the United States. And why is that? Because these agreements will have commitments and market opening, but that will be reserved for the participants to the agreement. And if the United States, we're on the outside, we're not getting those benefits. So I think over the medium and longer term, we could really end up losing out if we don't find a way to integrate our economy, more with other countries around the world.
And how is this all being viewed, to the best of your knowledge, at the World Trade Organization? These deals that we're talking about, the U.S.-Japan deal, and again, others like it, are a major departure from the usual way of doing things. They're not your traditional free trade agreement that would be notified to the WTO and kind of follow what's required by the GATT treaty. So how is this being viewed there?
Not well. I think silently many are horrified at what's going on. And why is that? And that is because one of the core principles of the WTO, most favored nation status, is being totally ignored in these agreements. What the WTO asks countries to do is that if you lower your tariff for country A, country B, then you also need to lower it for all other countries around the world, unless you're doing this as part of a comprehensive free trade agreement. And these agreements are not, comprehensive FTAs. And so we're seeing country after country unilaterally lowering their tariffs for US exports, but not for imports from other countries. And that technically does violate a core WTO principle at a time when the WTO, frankly, has, facing many other challenges, including its inability to really update its rules to reflect the, developments around the world. And so, I think the WTO remains an important organization. I don't think there's any clear sense of the Trump administration plans to withdraw from the WTO. But, unlike the years, for example, when Clayton Yeutter was USTR, USTRs used to spend a lot of time in Geneva and, negotiating these rounds where, a lot of trade liberalization was achieved. And those days are, frankly, they're just over.
So speaking of that, something we've been talking a lot about within our team is just this idea of path dependency, and so much changing so quickly, facts on the ground changing. To what degree, to the best you can assess this, at this point in time, are we being locked into a future that's going to be hard to shift even a few years from now?
So look, we're not going to go back to where we were on trade. That's clear. And even after the first Trump administration, the Biden team, if you notice, they did not roll back the tariffs against China or on steel. And steel and aluminum, they did a few quota agreements, but they kept protection in place. And they even added more tariffs against China, but in a very targeted manner. I think the next administration, whether it be Republican or Democratic, is going to have a very difficult time lifting these tariffs, because the U.S. will get used to them, and particularly those that are benefiting from the tariffs are going to fight tooth and nail not to get them lifted. But also, I think an administration is going to be pressed to give a rationale on why they're lifting the tariffs. And, that's kind of hard to explain if you're not getting anything in return. So I think, we're going to be living in a tariff world for the indefinite future. I think some of the tariffs indeed could be lowered. And we just saw last week, for example, the president lowered tariffs on on foodstuffs, including cocoa and coffee and bananas and certain fruits and vegetables that we don't even make and grow in the United States. And so I think there will be some increasing pressure on the administration in the lead up to the midterm elections in particular, to provide more exclusions and more exceptions to these high tariffs that are being applied basically to countries all around the world.
So that's actually something I haven't seen, the idea of exclusions, get a whole lot of attention. Like, to what degree do you see that exclusions are actually being granted for any of these?
I mean, let me tell you, there's long, long lists. And when you read these trade agreements, always look at the annexes, because that's where all the exclusions are. But what you'll find is they're all expressed in HS numbers, harmonized system numbers. So you have no idea what the products are. It's just mumbo jumbo, a lot of numbers. So you really need to know your product to see if indeed there has been an exclusion. But you are right. The administration is boasting more about the high tariffs and being kind of quiet about all of the exclusions and exceptions that are being granted. And I think we will see more going forward.
Do you see a time when we will maybe achieve a level of certainty that's helpful for businesses and agricultural producers? That's a word you hear a lot. Certainty is helpful for businesses, farmers. Is that on the horizon anytime soon?
Yeah, I can't be very optimistic on that front. I think that whether we like it or not, our president thrives on being unpredictable and uncertain and reading things, announcing things, and acting very quickly and impulsively. And so I think I'm hopeful that there'll be relatively more certainty, but I think all businesses and farmers and growers, they need to be prepared to live in a world of uncertainty when it comes to these tariffs. And this is really difficult for companies, particularly companies that are trying to make investment decisions, right? Or trying to decide, do we need to adjust our supply chains? I mean, Mr. Boyle showed in his slides just how integrated Kawasaki is with markets all around the world. And what I was thinking is you should just put tariff rates, but put them in pencil on each, on each country where the flags are, because things are changing all the time. And again, I hear from companies, all the time that they're holding off on making some big investment decisions until there is more certainty. And this is going, unfortunately, to hurt our economy and kind of, hurt the economic activity that's taking place in our economy. Now, at some point, you can't hold off investments forever, so you have to make the best decision ever. But companies may be very conservative about, how they plan their investments. I mean, take a country like India, for example. I mean, just a few years ago, India was kind of the go-to place to invest, particularly if you were leaving China. Great demographics, kind of could be a great counterweight to China, and really kind of moving up the value chain. But as of today, India has tariffs among the highest tariffs around the world at 50%. So if you're a company that's invested in India, a U.S. company, you're hurting from these tariffs, and particularly if you're selling the products you're making back to the United States. And so again, a lot of uncertainty, and even, I mean, you look at Trump's first term, Prime Minister Modi and Trump were like best friends. So again, all these relationships, I think, are, they're not as solid as we think they are. But there is talk that we're on at least a positive trajectory towards reaching an agreement with India soon, as well as working with them to reduce their oil imports from Russia, which could lead to a significant reduction in tariffs.
Okay, I have one more question for you on Japan before we open it up to any questions from the audience that you may have. And that is that there's certainly other facets to the relationship beyond trade and economics. Japan's a formal treaty ally of the United States. There's a lot of security cooperation. So how are these changing dynamics with trade and tariffs with Japan going to affect, if at all, other aspects of the relationship? Mm-hmm.
Look, they're all tied. And frankly, in recent years, these national security and economic security issues are becoming more and more integral to the trade agenda. It's very hard to kind of separate the two when you're talking about, with any country now. But particularly, again, with our allies, we do have a very rock-solid security alliance with Japan. In the past, when we had the highest trade tensions possible, there was always a lid put on them at some point by the White House because they didn't want the trade tensions to basically unwind the important security alliance. And here I would just say this marks like a complete distinction with China, because if you think about where we were at Japan in the 80s, in many ways we viewed Japan like we're viewing China today, as an economic threat. But the difference is we had a rock-solid security relationship with Japan, and so even if things got bad, there was a bottom. They couldn't go beyond a certain, they couldn't deteriorate beyond a certain level. But with China, we don't have any of that, and that's why the relations with China are so tense and so strained. And even with our one-year truce that was just announced during the president's meeting with Xi Jinping, there is a sense that anything can happen that can really upset this truce and kind of, null and void and, nullify it.
Okay. I'm going to turn now to any audience questions that we may have. If you could just wait for the mic, there will be one given to you. There it is.
Thanks. My name is Clayton, but that's not why I'm here. I was a Tokyo correspondent from '87 until '95 for UPI and also an editor for Bloomberg. So I was there when all these intense negotiations were happening, and I understood pretty well both sides of the argument. Today, of course, things are very different. I'd like to ask you two questions. First, the Japanese agricultural protectionist stand makes no economic sense, but it does make a survival sense in a hostile world. Japan's an island nation. For a long time, it didn't look like Japan was in a hostile world, but with an aggressive economic policy and a wavering security commitment, aren't we undermining the rationale that Japan might have for easing its protectionist agricultural policy? The other question I'd like to ask, if I could slip it in, is sometimes we treat Japan as if it were a totalitarian country. You say, okay, you commit $550 billion of investment. It's not. They don't have a piggy bank with $550 billion in it. They have a huge public debt, and they can't command companies to invest. The government does have a lot of influence, but companies have a lot of influence on the government. How realistic is it to expect that that kind of scale of investment will happen? Is it just a paper commitment, or do you realistically expect that sort of investment to flow? Thank you.
They're two really easy questions. So the second one first, and it's interesting. I was just in Tokyo a few weeks ago when the president was there, and it was just a coincidence. But the meetings I was having was right next door to Secretary Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, and his whole team, and they were trying to kind of, wrap up some of these deals so they could be announced by the president when he met with the new Japanese Prime Minister. And, I'll admit, I'm skeptical of this commitment. $550 billion is just a huge amount of money, right? And you're talking about 3.5 years. But all that said, I have to, my sense is that Japan is taking this commitment seriously. It's a commitment that was signed by the Japanese government along with the US government. The Japanese government is playing a very important role in helping to identify projects that would qualify under this commitment. So, yeah, I'm skeptical, but it's definitely much more than a paper commitment. And even if we don't see $550 billion, if we saw $300 billion or $275, that would be pretty, that's a nice chunk of change. With respect to your question on agriculture, I think what you're getting at is the whole question of food security. Exactly. And I can't tell you how many negotiations I was in with Japan, during the years when they would just talk about food security and how they wanted to get, from whatever 20% to 30% to 50%. And they've never really been able to get there. But I mean, I understand the point you're making. But that said, I think that this is a sector where, for an advanced country, particularly a country that benefits so much from trade, that their agriculture market should be further opened. They've gotten rid of now a lot of their tariffs for us, even though we left the TPP. They concluded a deal with the United States during Trump's first term, which, again, eliminated a lot of their tariffs in agriculture. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And, they're also moving to, undertake other reforms. But the market there are a lot of impediments there and a lot of restrictions. And again, as a large trading partner for the world, my view is that this is a market that they could further open without undermining their national security.
Thanks. Other questions? Oh, there's one up here.
Hi, I'm Dan Morgan from Burwell. We have done business in Japan in the beef business for the last 30 years, my family and I. It's an interesting market. It's a great market to participate in. We raise Wagyu beef, and I'm able to export it back to Japan and sell it for more money than the Japanese. But that also becomes a marketing issue. In all of my time spent in Japan, and I've been there 20 or 30 times, Japan has so many small producers that make incredible products. whether it be sauces, spices, clothes, whiskey, all kinds of things. But they are small companies and they don't have an interest in exporting. We in the US also have a lot of small companies, small family-owned businesses that make a lot of really incredible products, whether it be candies or clothes or boots or, a whole list of things. But because of their volume of production, both on the Japanese side and the American side, they don't export those products. With the internet and the international capabilities we have today, I would like to see some type of proposal focus, some small business thing put into place that would allow us to export those individual commodities much easier. Guys, filling a container load of meat takes a while, 40,000 pounds. Well, how about if we come up with some export documentation rules of some sort so that these students back here could form a company and bring products from Japan and introduce it into the American market and vice versa. You could form some companies here and export those products to Japan. I would just like to see if there's any way that we could start a discussion about that.
And my view is that things are changing for the better here. And you mentioned like the internet has made this a lot easier for small businesses to enter the export market. Many of these trade agreements also, by lowering tariffs, that helps small businesses, and getting rid of other barriers helps them. But there's so much more we could do on this front for sure. And I think, your suggestion is a worthwhile one and a kind of a really useful, a useful project. I think what's interesting too, through the years, we've seen Japanese agriculture producers exporting more, that all of a sudden they're realizing that there's a market in Asia and even in the United States for certain niche products. And so if you look at Japanese agriculture exports, they are on an upward trajectory. And I remember all the years negotiating with Japan, and they're like, we can't export, we're not interested in that, blah, 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 blah. And I think with time, they recognize that there is a potential market here. And so, they are exporting more and more.
Well, I see the Japanese products in Europe a lot because we also export to Europe. It's true what you're saying. 30 years ago, the Japanese said that, no, we are not exporting our pride and joy. And then they found out there was money to be made and there were customers to be had.
Exactly.
And so, I see that around the world.
I think we have time for one more question, if there is one. Yeah, Geithner, go ahead, and Mike will take yours too.
Ms. Cutler, you wouldn't know me, but you may know my late cousin Rand Castile, who was with the Japan Society long ago. I have a question about the professionalism of the Washington bureaucracy. We've seen the second Trump administration shatter longstanding traditions at the State Department. The DOJ culture now has been changed dramatically. The president's so iconoclastic on trade policy. What's your general sense of, at USTR and the Commerce Department, is there still basically a level of traditional professionalism, or is the culture there also being radically changed?
That's a great and interesting question. Just from a broader point of view, as a longtime civil servant, it does make me kind of sad that working for the government is not as attractive as it used to be. I mean, when I was entering the job market, like the idea, and I started at the Commerce Department and then moved to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, I just felt like these are the best jobs ever, particularly when you're young and you could accrue so much responsibility. The first negotiation I ever worked on was on improving the import licensing agreement in the WTO, and very few people cared about it. It was a very technical agreement. But I remember at a relatively young age, like sitting in Geneva with the United States flag in front of me, and I couldn't have been prouder. And so again, my experience working for the government is just unmatched. And, I still try and encourage students everywhere to really think of the government as a career. But it's a bit more difficult to make that pitch now because everyone's watching what's going on in the government. And granted, there's a lot of waste there and, places that could be cut. In my view, if you're going to do that, do it in a very methodical way after you've really analyzed what your needs are, where the redundancy is, and what makes sense. The good news is, and I'm just going to speak for USTR, my old home, and that is there haven't been any layoffs there. People there had worked for the current USTR, Jamison Greer, when he was chief of staff to Ambassador Lighthizer during Trump 1.0. And so he knows a lot of them already, and frankly, has a very good relationship with the career staff, is bringing them into the negotiating tables, including them in deliberations. And so the morale at USTR is quite high from what I understand, that they feel that they are being utilized and respected. There is some frustration that, that they don't know what exactly the White House is doing, but at least in their world, things are going relatively well. And so that gives me hope because I think, and I think you were hinting at this, to do these trade agreements, you really do need some, some critical expertise, okay? Like having sat at a negotiating table for many, many years, there are things other countries say that I don't even think twice. I totally get what they're saying. So like when Japan says something's very, very difficult, that's their nice way of saying, you know what, no way, we are never going to do that. And if you don't know that, and I remember once being with a boss of mine going into their office after some meeting with the Japanese, and they were so excited because the door was still open because Japan just said it was just difficult. And I'm like, no, 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 they're being polite. And basically difficult means no. And so, it's things like that when you're sitting at the table and you're hearing stuff and you've heard it so many times, but when you hear it for the first time, maybe it sounds a bit encouraging. So again, I think like if we're going to do, if trade's going to be a priority and we're going to spend so much time negotiating with other countries, I think it's really critical to have experienced expertise at the table. I totally respect whatever administration's in. They have, they've been voted in. They can come up with their own agenda. But again, I think it's so important that they value the career staff, that populates many of these agencies.
Thank you. Last question goes to Mike here.
Thank you. Last but not least. So as you probably guess, we are spending a lot of time on tariffs at our factory and our factories, and some of our compliance staff, or my colleagues, are here today. And if I don't ask a question, they're going to give me all kinds of grief. So you talked a little bit about the reciprocal tariffs for autos, and that some countries have a lower tariff rate than factories that are building automobiles here in the U.S. So a nuts and bolts question is, what is your advice about going about getting exclusions made to remedy that kind of situation for a company that is building product in the U.S. and being outdone by a foreign-built product as far as tariffs?
Mm-hmm. And, in the former days, and even during Trump 1.0, there was like a formal exclusion process where petitions were invited. You had to kind of make your case why you needed the tariff lowered for your product, and they would give you, there was kind of the buzzwords of the topics they wanted you to address. That process is totally eliminated. So what you have now is it's an ad hoc process. And the best I can tell, the best way to get an exclusion is to get your CEO down to Mar-a-Lago, or to find a way for your CEO or very senior folks in your company to interact with, senior people in the White House. And I know it's a huge lift and a very heavy lift, but that seems to be frankly what's working now. But I also, again, I do think that with time, just the way, along the lines of now coffee tariffs being eliminated, we may see other tariffs being eliminated, particularly those that are impacting and hurting companies that are investing in the United States or are moving their investments here. I mean, I was floored when I read something where China, it really wants to invest more in the United States. We made it very difficult for them, but there have been some suggestions that Trump might be open to Chinese investment in the United States. And apparently, China responded and said, if we're going to invest in the United States, we want to guarantee that you won't subject us to any of your tariffs while in the United States. Well, you can imagine if we were to give Chinese companies that exception and not the Kawasaki's of the world. So these tariffs, sometimes the policy, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. Or you want to encourage investment to the United States. But again, if our companies are paying 50% steel and aluminum tariffs, and there's talk of tariffs down, on industrial machinery being investigated under Section 232, I mean, this really, you know better than I, this is very costly for our companies and basically works at cross purposes with trying to encourage more investment here. So I just hope with time, the right hand and the left hand coordinate more. And frankly, I'll just conclude on this, another one of my hobby horses is that there's something to be said about kind of the top gives you the instructions of what they're trying to achieve, and then you ask your staff or experts to come up with options for you and to kind of alert you to the pros and cons of different options. So when you make your decision, you're doing that based on a whole range of important considerations. With our president, it just seems that he just decides, makes the decision, and then, over time, if folks come in and complain or express their concerns that he decides are valid, then he'll move off that. And I think it'd just be a lot more efficient to have a better policy-making process in Washington.
Well, we've gone a little past time. I want to thank Wendy and Mike again so much for sharing so much insight with us. Thank you. Thank you.